Over the year, I've worked with about 20 to 25 coaches from all levels of competition, and I've seen a lot of presentations and other pre-prepared content. Now, there's one piece of advice I've ended up giving 100% of the time, and I can guarantee that if you take this away and take it to heart, it will instantly make your presentations better. And that is make it shorter. This works for anyone. It doesn't matter if you're new to coaching or you've been doing it for years. Think about why we do presentations in the first place. You want it to be memorable, you want it to be clear, and you want to be efficient with time. Now, if we make the presentation, the actual delivery, shorter, not only are we even more efficient with time, but it actually becomes clearer and more memorable too. So let's take those points one by one, starting with memorable. Now, we prepare content in advance so that we can add things like examples, anecdotes, clips, videos, pictures, so that you can build up that emotional resonance with the players and make your point more memorable. Now, all of this is really good. We definitely don't want to stop doing that, but just be careful that the length of your presentation isn't undermining all that good work. The truth is, as humans, we really can't remember that many points at once. So for example, if I give you 100 facts to remember, the chance of you being able to do it effectively is pretty much zero. Whereas if I give you 3, it's obviously going to be much, much higher. The same is true in coaching. So if we take scouting prep as an example, as that's probably the most frequent form of prepared content in League of Legends, if I sit down with the team and say, well, the enemy team, this is how they play level 1, this is how they do laning, this is how they path in the jungle, this is how they do dragon, how they set up Baron, how they want to close out the game, how they play around Elder, what do you think the chances are that they'll remember all of that? In fact, I bet you couldn't tell me the exact areas of the game that I just talked about, even though I didn't add any extra information. So limit the number of points you're making in your presentation, try and keep it to 2 or 3 at most, and you'll find that they become much more memorable and those key ideas really are taken away and go to heart. The next reason we prepare in advance is for clarity. We want to be coherent and intelligible, and we want to try and avoid misunderstandings. What we often do in practice is we say the same point 4 or 5 slightly different ways in the hopes that if one of these is absolutely perfect, it's the best way. But in reality, often the more you talk, the less clear you become. This is because as you talk, you're leaving threads, little avenues for new ideas or new direction. Now, this might be absolutely great in conversation or in discussion, but in presentations, it's really terrible. Think about the scouting example from earlier. Let's say you're talking about how the enemy plays around dragon, and you say, okay, they do this with prio in mid because they pick X champion and X gets prio into anyone. Suddenly one of your players interjects saying, I think actually Y gets prio into X now since the last patch change. Now suddenly we're talking about patches and champions and prio when the point was actually around dragon. So choose your words carefully and deliberately, stick to one way of explaining your points, and you'll leave as few threads available for distraction. So the last reason we prepare in advance is to be efficient with time. So you go and watch 4 or 5 of the opponent's games and present your insights back to the group, and that way everyone else doesn't have to put in those hours too. But if your presentation is 45 minutes long when it could be 20, you aren't understanding how time works in a group setting. Now, anyone who's been on a team with me in the past will know that I'm very strong for being punctual, turning up on time. And people often say, oh, I'm only 10 minutes late, it's not that big a deal. But really, if we all spend 10 minutes waiting for you before we started the scrim, you haven't wasted just that time, you've wasted an hour of the team's time at least. 5 players and a coach who could all have been doing something useful in those 10 minutes. And it's the same when it comes to your presentations. If you talk for an extra 10 minutes even, you're wasting an hour of the team's time. So put in that extra effort to be as concise as possible and really value the time of the people that you're working with. Mark Twain once wrote, I apologise for writing you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one. When we're improvising a review, it's understandable that things can get a little bit long and a little bit rambling, although that is still a good skill to work on. But when we're preparing in advance, you have to understand that the main goal is for it to be as short as possible, while still being clear and memorable. And look, I understand you want to show how much effort you've put in, how many games of the opponent you've watched, or how many hours you've put into this presentation. I've been there, but we have to leave that aside. You have to prioritize your points. Stick to just 2 or 3 at most. You have to be precise with your language. Find one way of explaining things and stick to it. And you have to value the time of the group. Put in a little bit more by yourself to make things as short as possible when you're presenting back to the group. Do all these things and you'll see a jump in your presentation's effectiveness instantly.